Two American cops pull over a large black woman, making assumptions based on their prejudice and treating her with unwarranted disrespect. As they escalate the situation, they have no idea they're messing with one of the most powerful figures in the legal system, a top federal judge. When her true identity is revealed, their world is turned upside down, leaving them scrambling to face the consequences. This explosive encounter is a lesson in justice, accountability, and the danger of underestimating someone based on appearances. Don't miss this eye-opening story. Subscribe to our channel and hit like for more gripping content. The morning air carried a crisp edge as two patrol officers, Daniels and Moore, watched the streets from their cruiser. They exchanged snide remarks, their eyes narrowing as they noticed a woman exiting a sleek black sedan parked near the curb. Her size made her movements deliberate, but there was a striking confidence in her posture. Daniels signaled Moore, and they stepped out of the cruiser. The woman, unaware of their approach, adjusted her bag over her shoulder. The sound of their boots against the pavement made her pause, and she turned to face them. Daniels spoke first, his tone condescending, demanding identification. The woman remained calm, her expression unreadable, as she reached for her wallet. Moore's gaze lingered on the car, muttering under his breath about how someone like her could afford such a vehicle. The woman handed over her documents, her gaze steady. Daniels examined them, flipping through as if searching for something to question. His demeanor turned sharper as he accused her of parking violations and insinuated more. The woman replied evenly, pointing out the legality of her actions and the absence of any wrongdoing. Her voice carried a quiet authority that unsettled the officers. Daniels, feeling his control slipping, ordered her to step aside for a search. When she hesitated, his impatience boiled over. He grabbed her arm, his grip firm, but she didn't resist. Instead, she warned him calmly that his actions were inappropriate. Daniels pushed her against the cruiser, snapping the cuffs onto her wrists. Moore smirked, muttering something inaudible. They led her to their vehicle, ignoring the small crowd that had begun to gather, murmuring amongst themselves and recording the scene on their phones. The woman maintained her composure, her silence speaking volumes. At the station, Daniels completed the booking process with an air of self-satisfaction. Moore leaned back in his chair, recounting the incident to a colleague with exaggerated details. Meanwhile, the woman sat quietly in the holding area, her calm demeanor unshaken. Officers passing by stole glances at her, puzzled by her unbothered attitude. In the interrogation room, Daniels and Moore entered, eager to assert their authority. They began questioning her aggressively, trying to provoke a reaction. She responded with calculated precision, countering their accusations with logical explanations. Each answer she gave chipped away at their confidence. Suddenly, the door opened, and a senior officer stepped in, carrying a file. He glanced at the woman, then at the two officers, his expression unreadable. He handed Daniels the file and motioned for him to open it. As Daniels scanned the contents, the color drained from his face. Moore leaned in, his smirk vanishing as he read over Daniels' shoulder. The file revealed her identity, a federal prosecutor with an impeccable record. The senior officer addressed the two, his tone sharp, questioning their judgment and actions. The woman, now unshackled, rose from her seat, her composed demeanor intact. She looked at Daniels and Moore, her gaze piercing, as she spoke with quiet determination, outlining the gravity of their misconduct and the consequences they would face. As she exited the room, the weight of their actions began to sink in for the two officers. The station buzzed with whispers as word of her identity spread. Daniels and Moore avoided eye contact with their colleagues, the realization of their mistake hitting them harder with each passing second. The woman walked out of the station, her head held high, leaving a silence that lingered long after she was gone. The scene concluded with Daniels and Moore being called into the chief's office, their expressions a mix of dread and regret. The woman's words echoed in their minds, a reminder of the reckoning they would face. The balance of power had shifted, and the aftermath of their actions had only just begun. The aftermath of the encounter had left a ripple effect that none of the officers anticipated. Sarah Watkins, the senior officer involved in the incident, tried to maintain a facade of confidence as she sat at her desk the following morning. The whispers from her colleagues had begun to grow louder, and the brief glances in her direction were no longer subtle. Despite her attempt to shrug it off, the weight of the tension in the station was undeniable. Meanwhile, Mark Reynolds, her younger partner and the second officer involved, was grappling with his own sense of unease. Unlike Sarah, Mark had a conscience that nagged at him incessantly. His mind replayed the look on Ava Daniels' face when they had confronted her in the parking lot. Ava, the woman they had dismissed and humiliated, had exuded a quiet strength that now haunted him. Elsewhere, Ava Daniels was calm but purposeful. Her day at the courthouse had started like any other. As a federal prosecutor, she was accustomed to high-pressure situations, but this time, her personal life had collided with her professional identity. While she processed the legal documents in her office, her phone buzzed with messages from colleagues who had seen the video circulating online. The encounter with the officers had been recorded by several onlookers, and it was now spreading rapidly across social media platforms. In one corner of the station, Detective Lucy Ramirez observed Sarah and Mark from a distance. Ramirez had been on the force long enough to recognize when something deeper was brewing. Her instincts told her that the incident would escalate, and her gut feeling was rarely wrong. She made a mental note to investigate further, sensing that this would go beyond the usual backlash. Sarah received an email from Chief Michael Carter, instructing her to report to his office immediately. The chief's tone was clear. This was not a casual meeting. As Sarah entered his office, Carter's expression was grim. He wasted no time addressing the matter. The public outrage was growing, and the department was under scrutiny. Carter informed Sarah that an internal investigation had been launched. Her defensiveness was met with his unyielding gaze. For the first time, she felt the ground beneath her beginning to crack. Mark, on the other hand, was trying to distance himself from the incident. He avoided Sarah's calls and spent his time poring over past cases where he had crossed ethical boundaries. His guilt was not just about Ava, but about the system he had blindly followed for years. He remembered Ramirez's words from months ago when she had subtly warned him about his behavior. He had dismissed her then, but now, her words rang true. Back at the courthouse, Ava received a call from her friend and fellow prosecutor, Denise Carter. Denise had seen the video and was furious on Ava's behalf. Ava assured her that she was handling it, but Denise insisted on getting involved. Together, they began compiling evidence that would not only address the individual actions of Sarah and Mark, but also expose the systemic issues within the department. Ava's approach was methodical, as she knew this wasn't just about personal vindication, it was about creating lasting change. The media caught wind of the story, and soon reporters were stationed outside the police department and courthouse. Sarah's name was leaked, and she became the face of the controversy. Her initial arrogance faded as the backlash became personal. Mark's name hadn't been revealed yet, but he knew it was only a matter of time. The pressure pushed him further into isolation. Lucy Ramirez decided to confront Mark directly. She found him in the break room, staring blankly at his coffee cup. She didn't mince words, telling him that if he wanted to salvage any part of his career and conscience, he needed to come clean. Mark's reluctance was evident, but Ramirez's sincerity struck a chord. She wasn't trying to punish him, she was offering him a way to take responsibility before it was too late. In parallel, Ava's investigation uncovered a pattern of misconduct tied to Sarah Watkins. Over the years, Sarah had been the subject of multiple complaints, all swept under the rug. Ava's team reached out to past victims, and one by one, they began to speak out. Each testimony added another layer to the case, painting a damning picture of Sarah's abuse of power. The situation took a dramatic turn when an anonymous tipster provided Ava with internal emails from the police department. These emails revealed a culture of complicity, where officers like Sarah were protected by their superiors. Ava shared the findings with Denise, and together they strategized on how to present the evidence in court while ensuring the safety of the whistleblower. Mark, now consumed by guilt, decided to write a formal statement detailing the events of the incident and his complicity. He approached Ramirez for guidance, and she promised to support him through the process. His decision to come forward caused a rift between him and Sarah, who felt betrayed. Their confrontation was heated, but Mark's resolve didn't waver. He was determined to make amends, even if it meant sacrificing his career. As the internal investigation progressed, Chief Carter faced mounting pressure from both the public and city officials. He held a press conference, during which he announced that Sarah had been placed on administrative leave and that the department was cooperating fully with the external review. His words were measured, but the tension in his voice was palpable. The climax of the second act came when Ava filed a federal civil rights lawsuit against Sarah and the department. The lawsuit was accompanied by a detailed exposé that highlighted systemic failures within the police force. The public response was immediate and overwhelming. Protests erupted across the city, with demonstrators demanding accountability and reform. Sarah, now ostracized, found herself alone. Her calls to her former allies were ignored, and her attempts to defend herself online only worsened her situation. Mark, however, found solace in his decision to come forward. While he faced his own share of criticism, he also received messages of support from those who believed in his effort to make things right. The final moments of this chapter saw Ava standing before a crowd at a community rally. Her speech was powerful and heartfelt, emphasizing the importance of justice and accountability. She assured the crowd that this was just the beginning and vowed to see the case through to the end. As the crowd erupted in applause, Ava felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the fight for justice was far from over. The courtroom buzzed with a quiet energy as the case's significance began to sink into the minds of everyone present. The federal prosecutor, Olivia Carter, maintained her composed demeanor, her curvaceous figure and commanding presence drawing the attention of every eye. Two officers, Daniels and Murphy, sat in silence at the defense table. Neither man could shake the sense of unease that had settled over them since their arrest. They exchanged furtive glances but avoided looking at Olivia, whose calm exterior belied the storm brewing beneath. Earlier, the prosecution had presented evidence that challenged not only the officers' conduct but the underlying system that had enabled their actions. Olivia, determined and unrelenting, had spent weeks building her case. Her sharp mind and meticulous attention to detail had uncovered patterns of misconduct hidden under layers of bureaucracy. Daniels, the more senior of the two officers, had dismissed the initial allegations as baseless. Murphy, younger and less seasoned, had followed suit, though he now regretted his blind loyalty. As the judge entered, the room fell silent. Olivia rose, delivering an opening statement that left no doubt about the seriousness of the case. She painted a vivid picture of the events leading to her unlawful detention, describing how Daniels and Murphy had leveraged their authority to humiliate and degrade her. The judge's furrowed brow indicated the gravity of the charges. Olivia's voice, steady and precise, filled the room with undeniable truth. The narrative shifted to the testimony of witnesses. First to take the stand was a store employee who had observed the initial confrontation. The employee's account was damning, detailing how Daniels had escalated a minor interaction into a full-blown spectacle. Murphy had stood by, offering no intervention as Daniels's actions became increasingly aggressive. Olivia's questions were incisive, her tone cutting through the defense's attempts to discredit the witness. Meanwhile, Daniels's internal struggle grew evident. His confidence faltered as he listened to the evidence against him. The body camera footage presented by Olivia was irrefutable. It showed Daniels's disdainful expression, the deliberate condescension in his tone, and his use of unnecessary force. The courtroom gasped collectively as the video ended, leaving a damning silence in its wake. Murphy's discomfort deepened. Olivia's strategy shifted, zeroing in on his complicity. She highlighted his inaction, emphasizing that silence in the face of injustice was as culpable as the actions themselves. Murphy's face flushed with shame. He had never imagined himself in this position, but Olivia's relentless questioning forced him to confront his own failings. The defense scrambled to regain control. Their attorney, a seasoned litigator, attempted to downplay the severity of the officers' actions. He argued that their behavior, while regrettable, was not indicative of systemic bias. Olivia countered swiftly, presenting a pattern of complaints against Daniels that spanned years. Each piece of evidence painted a damning portrait of an officer who had long operated with impunity. The tension reached a breaking point when Olivia introduced the testimony of a young black man who had also been targeted by Daniels. His voice trembled as he recounted his experience, but his words carried undeniable weight. Olivia's gentle yet firm questioning allowed the witness to reveal the trauma he had endured. The courtroom's collective empathy shifted palpably, the reality of systemic injustice laid bare. As the day progressed, Murphy's resolve weakened further. During a recess, he found himself alone in a small, stark room. The weight of the proceedings bore down on him. Olivia's words echoed in his mind, and for the first time, he questioned the decisions that had led him here. His thoughts were interrupted by Daniels, who entered the room with a scowl. Daniels's attempts to rally Murphy were futile. The younger officer's guilt had taken root, and he could no longer ignore his conscience. Murphy's decision to break ranks became evident when he took the stand. Olivia's cross-examination was precise, and Murphy's admissions unraveled the defense's narrative. He acknowledged the systemic issues within their department, implicating Daniels further and exposing a culture of complicity. The courtroom's atmosphere shifted as Murphy's testimony concluded. Daniels's facade of confidence shattered. Olivia's closing argument was a masterclass in persuasion. She implored the jury to consider not only the actions of the defendants, but the broader implications of their behavior. Her words resonated deeply, her call for accountability striking a chord with everyone present. When the verdict was delivered, the courtroom erupted in a mixture of relief and reflection. Daniels was found guilty on multiple counts, while Murphy's cooperation earned him leniency. Olivia's victory was not just a personal triumph, but a step toward systemic change. As she exited the courtroom, her head held high, she knew the battle was far from over. However, this victory was a powerful reminder that justice, though arduous, was within reach. The situation inside the precinct escalated as news of the morning's events began to circulate among the officers. Detective Carter and Officer Mills' behavior had come under scrutiny, not only from the Internal Affairs Department but also from the public. The entire precinct felt the mounting pressure as protesters gathered outside, chanting for justice and accountability. Inside, Carter and Mills were summoned to the commander's office, their demeanor shifting between nervousness and defiance. The commander, a no-nonsense figure, wasted no time in addressing the issue. Their actions were being closely examined, and any misstep could mean the end of their careers. Carter argued that everything they did was by the book, but the commander's icy glare silenced him. She laid out the evidence gathered from body cam footage and civilian accounts, highlighting the discrepancies and the clear abuse of power. Mills' face turned pale as he realized how damning the evidence was. Meanwhile, prosecutor Lana Davis was preparing for the next move. She'd spent hours reviewing the case file and gathering additional evidence to support her claims. Lana was meticulous, connecting dots that painted a much larger picture of systemic issues within the precinct. She knew she was up against not just two officers, but an ingrained culture of bias and misconduct. As the day progressed, an unexpected witness came forward. This was a former colleague of Carter and Mills who'd left the force due to the toxic environment. The witness provided damning testimony about the officer's history of targeting minorities under flimsy pretenses, further solidifying Lana's case. The witness's revelations were a turning point, adding credibility to the accusations. Carter and Mills began to realize the gravity of their situation. Mills' overconfidence started to wane, replaced by a nervous energy as he paced back and forth in the break room. Carter, on the other hand, was defiant, convinced that they could weather the storm if they stuck to their story. However, cracks in their unity began to show as the pressure mounted. That evening, Lana received an anonymous tip about potential evidence hidden by the officers. It was said to be in an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a location known to be frequented by shady dealings. She immediately alerted a trusted investigator, arranging to retrieve the evidence under cover of night. This was a risky move, but the potential payoff was too significant to ignore. The investigator, a seasoned professional, ventured into the warehouse under the cover of darkness. The air was tense, every creak of the building amplifying the danger of the situation. After what felt like hours, the investigator uncovered a stash of documents and a burner phone, both of which contained incriminating evidence against Carter and Mills. The phone's messages revealed a pattern of targeting specific individuals and fabricating reports to justify their actions. Back at the precinct, the tension was palpable. Carter was growing paranoid, convinced that someone within the department was feeding information to Lana. Mills, trying to maintain composure, suggested they get ahead of the situation by destroying any remaining evidence that could implicate them. However, this decision would come back to haunt them. Lana presented the newly uncovered evidence to the court the next morning. The documents and messages painted a damning picture of Carter and Mills' misconduct, adding weight to her case. Public outrage grew as the evidence was made public, and media outlets began to highlight the systemic issues within the precinct. In response, the precinct's higher-ups initiated damage control, suspending Carter and Mills pending a full investigation. This move did little to quell the public's anger, as many demanded deeper accountability. Protests outside the courthouse grew larger, with activists and community leaders calling for sweeping reforms. As Carter and Mills faced mounting pressure, their relationship began to deteriorate further. Accusations flew between them as they blamed each other for their predicament. Carter accused Mills of being careless, while Mills retorted that Carter's arrogance was the root of their troubles. Their once united front crumbled, exposing the fragility of their partnership. Meanwhile, Lana continued to build her case. She interviewed several of the officers' past victims, documenting their experiences and presenting a compelling narrative of systemic abuse. Each testimony added another layer to the case, strengthening her argument that this was not an isolated incident but part of a broader pattern. As the case neared its climax, an internal whistleblower stepped forward. This individual provided crucial information about a cover-up orchestrated by Carter and Mills to hide their misconduct. The whistleblower's account was detailed and corroborated by existing evidence, further sealing the officer's fate. The final moments of this scene were tense. Carter and Mills, now fully aware of the depth of the case against them, were left scrambling for a defense. Their desperation was evident as they attempted to manipulate the narrative, but it was too late. The weight of the evidence against them was insurmountable. Lana's closing argument was powerful, emphasizing the importance of accountability and justice. She addressed the court with a calm yet commanding presence, her words resonating with everyone in the room. The scene ended with the court adjourning, leaving the audience on the edge of their seats as they awaited the verdict. The events picked up momentum as the web of lies surrounding the two officers and the federal prosecutor began to unravel in ways none of them had anticipated. Officer Martinez, sitting in his dimly lit apartment, replayed the day's events in his mind. Every decision seemed to have brought him closer to an irreversible mistake. He couldn't shake the image of the woman, strong, poised, and in control despite the aggression he and Officer Carter had displayed. The memory of her words pierced through his defenses, unsettling him more than he cared to admit. At the precinct, Officer Carter had no such reservations. For him, the woman was merely another defiant individual he needed to bring under control. However, he began to feel the heat when the department's legal advisors summoned him to a private meeting. The room was tense, filled with the quiet hum of suspicion and suppressed frustration. The advisors' questions were pointed, seeking clarity on every minute detail of the incident. Carter's responses were clipped and defensive, but even he could sense that his story was beginning to falter under scrutiny. Martinez's absence in this meeting didn't go unnoticed. The seeds of doubt started to spread through the room. Meanwhile, the federal prosecutor, Camille Ellis, was not one to let injustice slide. Despite the lingering tension from her confrontation with the officers, her resolve only grew stronger. In her office, she meticulously reviewed footage from the precinct and witness statements. Her network within the legal system began to mobilize, as she prepared to use the law as her weapon against the prejudice and abuse she had experienced. Each file she reviewed, each witness she contacted, brought her closer to building a case that would expose systemic issues far beyond Carter and Martinez. Back at the precinct, the growing unease between the two officers began to surface. Martinez's guilt clashed with Carter's arrogance. Their whispered arguments in the locker room escalated as Martinez's fear of consequences clashed with Carter's unwavering belief that their positions would protect them. "You don't understand what's at stake here," Martinez hissed, his voice shaking. "She's not some ordinary civilian. She's got connections, Carter. Real ones." Carter dismissed his partner's concerns with a wave of his hand. "She's just another face in the crowd. They all think they're untouchable until they're not. We followed protocol." But even as he said it, doubt flickered across his face. Unbeknownst to the officers, Camille had already filed formal complaints and launched an internal investigation into their conduct. The department's leadership, aware of the potential public relations nightmare, convened an emergency meeting. Captain Hargrove, a seasoned officer with a reputation for navigating departmental crises, took charge. He read the preliminary report with a grim expression. It was clear to him that this case had the potential to escalate into a media storm. His mind raced with strategies to contain the damage. Hargrove's interrogation of Carter and Martinez was swift and unrelenting. Carter's bravado faltered under the captain's piercing gaze, while Martinez's hesitations turned into stammering confessions. Hargrove's frustration grew as he realized that the officers' actions were indefensible. The captain's decision to temporarily suspend both officers pending further investigation was met with outrage from Carter, who stormed out of the precinct, muttering curses under his breath. Martinez, on the other hand, slumped in his chair, consumed by shame and fear. As the case gained traction, Camille's efforts began to attract attention. Journalists and activists rallied behind her, amplifying her voice and putting pressure on the department. Community leaders organized town halls to address systemic discrimination in law enforcement, using Camille's story as a rallying cry. The officer's actions became the focal point of a larger conversation about accountability and bias within the justice system. Carter, now isolated and paranoid, turned to an old acquaintance for advice. His contact, a lawyer with a dubious reputation, urged him to discredit Camille's claims. Attack her credibility. Make her the villain, the lawyer suggested, sliding a folder of fabricated evidence across the table. Carter hesitated but ultimately took the folder, desperate to save his career. Martinez, however, chose a different path. Unable to live with the weight of his conscience, he reached out to Camille. Under the cover of night, he met her in a quiet diner on the outskirts of town. His hands trembled as he slid a USB drive across the table. "This is everything," he whispered. "The body cam footage, the internal memos, all of it. I can't keep pretending this didn't happen." Camille studied him for a moment, her expression unreadable, before nodding in acknowledgement. The USB drive proved to be a treasure trove of evidence. Camille's legal team worked tirelessly to compile a case that not only targeted Carter and Martinez, but also highlighted broader issues within the department. Her determination to see justice served inspired others to come forward with their stories, adding fuel to the growing movement for reform. As the legal proceedings began, the courtroom became a battleground. Carter's lawyer employed every tactic to shift blame and undermine the prosecution's case. Martinez, called as a witness for the prosecution, faced relentless cross-examination. His testimony, however, was unwavering. He recounted the events with raw honesty, his voice breaking as he admitted his complicity and expressed remorse. The turning point came when Camille presented the body cam footage in court. The unfiltered evidence left no room for misinterpretation. Gasps echoed through the courtroom as the footage revealed Carter's aggressive behavior and Martinez's silent complicity. Camille's closing arguments were a powerful call to action, demanding accountability not just for her case but for the countless others who had suffered similar injustices. The jury's deliberation was swift. Carter was found guilty of misconduct and abuse of power, while Martinez's cooperation earned him a reduced sentence. The department, under immense public pressure, committed to implementing comprehensive reforms, including mandatory bias training and independent oversight. As the dust settled, Camille stood on the courthouse steps, addressing a crowd of supporters and journalists. Her voice carried a mix of triumph and resolve as she spoke about the need for continued vigilance and systemic change. Martinez, watching from a distance, felt a glimmer of hope amidst his guilt. He had taken the first step toward redemption, even if the road ahead was long and uncertain. Carter, meanwhile, sat alone in his dimly lit apartment, his career and reputation in ruins. The folder of fabricated evidence lay discarded on the floor, a testament to his failed attempts to manipulate the truth. The weight of his actions pressed heavily on him as he grappled with the reality of his choices. In the end, the case became a catalyst for change. Camille's courage and resilience ignited a movement that resonated far beyond the confines of the courtroom. The story of two officers and the woman they underestimated served as a stark reminder of the power of accountability and the enduring fight for justice. The tension was palpable as multiple threads of the story began to converge. Naomi Harper, the federal prosecutor who had spent weeks navigating the labyrinth of corruption and prejudice, was finally closing in on the truth. Meanwhile, officers Daniels and Carter, shaken by their dwindling influence and exposed biases, clung desperately to their positions of authority. Naomi reviewed the files in her office, her heart pounding with a mix of determination and apprehension. Every document she held painted a grim picture of systemic bias and abuse. Her next move was to present her findings to an oversight committee, but she knew the risks. Her adversaries were growing desperate. The mounting evidence left them cornered, and desperation often bred dangerous reactions. Elsewhere, Daniels paced his living room. His thoughts raced as he scrolled through social media posts highlighting his recent actions. A tide of public opinion was turning against him, and he felt the walls closing in. Carter, on the other hand, sat in his car parked outside a nondescript building, his fingers drumming nervously on the steering wheel. He had received a cryptic message from an unknown source claiming they had information that could salvage his reputation. Despite his growing paranoia, he clung to the hope of a way out. Naomi met with her team in a secured conference room. Her colleague Marcus, a data analyst, laid out the connections they had uncovered. Financial transactions, private communications, and testimonies all pointed to a network of corruption that reached high into law enforcement and local governance. "This isn't just about Daniels and Carter," Marcus said. "They're pawns in a much bigger game." Naomi nodded, her resolve hardening. "Then we'll take down the whole board," she replied, her voice steady. At the same time, Carter met his informant, a shadowy figure named Greaves, in a dimly lit bar. Greaves handed over a USB drive and whispered, "This has what you need. Use it wisely." Carter's hands trembled as he accepted the drive. He didn't fully trust Greaves but felt he had no choice. Unbeknownst to him, the meeting was being monitored. A discreet camera captured every moment, adding another layer to the growing web of intrigue. Naomi prepared for the committee hearing, but as she stepped out of her office, she noticed an unmarked envelope on her desk. Inside was a photograph of her with her family, taken during a recent outing. Scrawled across it were the words, "Stop or face the consequences." Her chest tightened, but she refused to let fear dictate her actions. She immediately alerted security, ensuring her team's safety while intensifying her resolve to see the case through. Daniels received a late-night call from Carter, who was frantic. "They're on to us," Carter hissed. "I met someone who gave me a way out, but I think we're being set up." Daniels' usual bravado faltered. "We stick to the plan," he said, though his voice betrayed uncertainty. Both men knew they were running out of time. The next morning, Naomi entered the hearing room. The air was thick with anticipation as the committee members took their seats. She began her presentation, laying out the evidence meticulously. Each slide, each statement, painted an undeniable picture of corruption and bias. The room buzzed with murmurs as her words struck home. The chairman leaned forward, his expression grave. "Ms. Harper, your evidence is compelling, but these are serious accusations. Are you prepared to face the backlash this will undoubtedly bring?" Naomi met his gaze firmly. "Justice demands it." Meanwhile, Daniels and Carter scrambled to cover their tracks. Carter tried to decrypt the USB drive, only to discover it contained fabricated evidence meant to implicate them further. Realizing they had been outmaneuvered, Daniels lashed out, smashing a glass in frustration. "We're being played," he growled. Carter's hands shook as he muttered, "Then we fight back." Their fight-back plan took a sinister turn. That evening, Naomi received a call from an anonymous number. The voice on the other end was cold. "Drop the case, or the people you care about will pay the price." Naomi's mind raced as she ended the call. She immediately contacted her team, instructing them to go into protective custody. She refused to be intimidated but knew she had to act swiftly. The tension reached a boiling point when Daniels and Carter, now fully aware of the net closing around them, decided to confront Naomi directly. They ambushed her outside her office, demanding she drop the case. Naomi, standing her ground, responded with steely determination. "The truth will come out, whether you like it or not." Her calm demeanor only fueled their desperation. In a final desperate move, Daniels and Carter attempted to destroy key evidence by setting fire to the records room of the precinct. Their plan backfired spectacularly when the fire triggered the building's security systems, capturing their actions on surveillance cameras. Within hours, the footage was leaked to the media, sealing their fates. The climax came during a live press conference where Naomi unveiled the full extent of her findings. She stood before a sea of reporters, her voice unwavering as she detailed the corruption and prejudice that had permeated the system. As she spoke, news broke of Daniels and Carter's arrest, their mugshots flashing across screens nationwide. Naomi's journey was far from over, but the tide had turned. Her actions had sparked a movement, inspiring others to stand up against injustice. As the crowd outside chanted her name, she felt a flicker of hope. The battle was hard fought, but the fight for justice had only just begun. The courtroom was alive with tension as the pivotal moment arrived. The federal prosecutor, known now for her resilience and precision, stood calmly by the prosecutor's table. Opposite her, the two officers who had once underestimated her sat in their seats, visibly uneasy. The crowd behind them buzzed with hushed whispers as anticipation hung heavy in the air. The judge entered the courtroom, commanding silence with her mere presence. Everyone rose, then sat down at her command. The prosecutor's gaze never wavered, her confidence unshaken. This was the moment she had been preparing for, a culmination of relentless effort, emotional strain, and the unwavering pursuit of justice. The evidence was presented swiftly and methodically, leaving no room for doubt. The prosecutor narrated the events leading up to the confrontation with the two officers. Her voice was firm but measured, each word carrying weight. The timeline was irrefutable, supported by body cam footage, witness statements, and the officer's own recorded conversations. Every revelation elicited gasps from the gallery as the extent of the officer's misconduct became undeniable. She painted a vivid picture of systemic abuse, a pattern that had existed long before her case came to light. It wasn't just about her, it was about every person who had been wronged by those sworn to protect them. The prosecutor's words resonated deeply with the audience, many of whom had experienced or known someone affected by similar injustices. The first officer, a man who once carried himself with arrogance, now squirmed uncomfortably under the judge's scrutiny. His defense attorney attempted to deflect blame, citing procedural ambiguities and isolated errors. The prosecutor's rebuttal was swift and scathing, dismantling each argument with cold, hard facts. The second officer, visibly nervous, avoided eye contact with anyone, his posture betraying his guilt. Throughout the proceedings, the prosecutor remained composed, her demeanor a stark contrast to the officer's growing desperation. The climax of her argument came when she recounted her arrest, an act so steeped in prejudice that it left no room for interpretation. Her voice wavered slightly, not out of fear but from the emotional weight of reliving that day. The gallery's silence was deafening, broken only by the scribbling of reporters' pens. When the prosecutor concluded her statement, the defense was granted the opportunity to cross-examine. The officer's attorneys attempted to shift the narrative, framing their clients as victims of a political agenda. But their efforts fell flat against the mountain of evidence. The prosecutor's calm responses highlighted the absurdity of their claims, further solidifying her position. The judge's verdict was anticipated with bated breath. After hours of deliberation, she returned to the courtroom, her expression unreadable. The gallery leaned forward collectively as the judge began to speak. Her words were measured, her tone firm. She acknowledged the bravery it took for the prosecutor to bring this case forward, the courage of the witnesses who testified, and the importance of addressing systemic failures. The officers were found guilty on multiple counts, ranging from abuse of power to racial profiling. The gallery erupted into applause, a wave of relief washing over those who had been waiting for justice. The prosecutor allowed herself a small triumphant smile as the officers were led away in handcuffs, their once imposing figures now diminished. As the courtroom emptied, the prosecutor lingered for a moment, reflecting on the journey that had brought her here. She had faced humiliation, doubt, and immense pressure, but she had emerged victorious. Her resolve had not only secured justice for herself, but also set a precedent for others to follow. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, holding signs and chanting slogans of support. Reporters swarmed her as she stepped out, microphones thrust forward, cameras flashing. She addressed them briefly, emphasizing the collective effort it took to achieve this victory. Her words were powerful yet humble, acknowledging that while this was a significant step, the fight against systemic injustice was far from over. The officer's downfall sent ripples through the community and beyond. Internal investigations were launched, uncovering further misconduct within their precinct. Policies were re-examined, and mandatory training programs were implemented to address implicit bias and accountability. The prosecutor's case became a catalyst for change, inspiring others to speak out against corruption and inequality. In the weeks that followed, the prosecutor continued her work, now with an even stronger resolve. She met with activists, community leaders, and fellow legal professionals to discuss ways to effect meaningful reform. Her experience became a beacon of hope, a reminder that even in the face of adversity, justice could prevail. One evening, as she sat in her office reviewing case files, a letter arrived. It was from one of the officers, now serving time. The letter was an apology, filled with regret and a newfound understanding of the harm he had caused. The prosecutor read it carefully, her emotions a mix of validation and sorrow. She didn't respond but placed the letter in her drawer, a reminder of the impact her actions had made. Months turned into years, and the prosecutor's legacy grew. Her case was studied in law schools, her story shared in campaigns for judicial reform. She remained steadfast in her mission, using her platform to advocate for those who couldn't fight for themselves. The final scene found her standing on the steps of the courthouse once more, surrounded by a crowd of supporters. As she addressed them, her voice carried the same determination that had driven her from the beginning. She spoke of unity, accountability, and the power of standing together against injustice. The crowd erupted into cheers, their collective energy a testament to the change she had inspired. As the sun set, casting a warm glow over the courthouse, The prosecutor turned and walked inside. Her journey was far from over, but she faced the future with unwavering resolve. She knew the path ahead would be challenging, but she was ready, her spirit unbroken, her purpose clear. Justice, she had learned, was not a destination but a relentless pursuit, one she was committed to for as long as it took.